always interesting to see where a manufacturer draws the line for an acceptable computer in any given year, and as demonstrated by today's victim, Dell's standards are currently pretty damn low. This is their bottom-end Inspiron 153520, and this one's comes straddled with a dual-core CPU, a tiny SSD, horrible TN screen with a resolution from the mid-2000s, and potentially a class action lawsuit. Anyway, more on all that later. Design-wise, you're looking at a completely generic and soulless 15-inch laptop with a stupid lifty hinge design, ports on the left and right, and acres of the cheapest kind of dull grey plastic. Seriously, look at it. It's so drab and miserable. Thankfully, the basic design is reasonably sane, other than the annoying lifty hinge, and there's no sharp edges or knee-murdering protrusions to speak of. Dimensions are fairly standard for a device in this class, and weight is totally acceptable with the tiny charging brick adding almost nothing. Included in the fully recyclable packaging is the usual, the laptop itself, minuscule 65-watt charger, and a small amount of documentation. It's worth pointing out that Dell made the initial unboxing of this machine particularly nice, with a very well laid out initial presentation and a silly little welcome card. Fit and finish on this machine is genuinely awful. It seriously could not feel more cheap, but there were no noticeable assembly or cosmetic faults on this one out of the box. Connectivity is typical for machines in this class with the bare minimum of everything. Once again, we've got the now vintage USB 2.0 and HDMI 1.4 on board. All ports on the right hand side, the audio I/O jack, USB 2.0 and the SD card reader are mounted on a replaceable daughter board. But other than the DC in jack, all the ports on the left are soldered on. Still technically replaceable, but far from modular. Dell's trackpads are usually what you could call vaguely acceptable, and this one makes no exception. It's not particularly nice to use, and the integrated button feels extremely fragile and inconsistent over the clickable tracking surface, but it works and it's reasonably accurate. The trackpad is designed to rest directly against the battery to give it a little bit of extra solidity, and that's a benefit the keyboard has not been blessed with. That keyboard is a full-size unit with a number pad. It's not backlit, and the keycaps are so low contrast that they completely disappear under all sorts of completely normal lighting conditions. The flimsy little keys have extremely short and unstable travel, and the leading edge of the palm rest is too sharp. Wonderful. As usual, the keyboard is difficult to replace since it's plastic welded into the top case, and it's backed with a wafer-thin strip of aluminium. This thin token effort at reinforcement does absolutely nothing. The entire structure of the top case is as floppy as a piece of paper, even with the motherboard and cooling components still installed. The Inspiron isn't winning any points here, so let's just move on. In their infinite wisdom, Dell's engineers have decided to crank the hinge resistance up to an absolutely insane level on this one. The display lid requires a peak of 1042 grams of force to lift from fully closed, with the lid bending like a banana in the process, and then 470 grams to move in either direction from a 90-degree angle. The lid then continues to need more than 320 grams of force to move all the way to the end of its travel, which relative to the machine's weight is tight enough that the base of the laptop will lift up completely from any angle. Well, you'd certainly hope that the structure is pretty beefy on the inside, or this is just asking for trouble. Prepare for disappointment. Inside the base of the machine, the basic structure is looking just about alright. The hinge brackets extend a reasonable, if asymmetric, distance into the keyboard deck area, which looks to be a minimal effort to spread the mechanical load out over a larger area. 2 out of the 3 screw bosses on each side are a solid part of the metal reinforcement plate, minimizing the amount of stress taken directly by soft plastics. That's good, and it should be enough to prevent this area from fatiguing and tearing apart. So, no major crimes down here. Let's keep looking. Underneath the display bezel where the hinges bolt directly to the lid, wow. Those are unbelievably tiny 3 by 1.5 centimeter plates bolting into 3 tiny screw bosses that are themselves squished into tiny weak plastic housings. Just to recap, we have a record-settingly stiff hinge with record-settingly small attachment points to the soft and weak plastic lid. Congratulations, Dell, this is officially the crappiest hinge design we've ever seen on this channel. Unfortunately, we already know for a fact that these things fail fast, way too fast. Owners are in large numbers having to have these replaced within the first couple of years of the machine's life, and it's easy to see why. Once it's broken, if there's no warranty left and no extended service program, you're faced with the prospect of spending a couple of $100 repairing a completely mediocre laptop that only cost a couple of $100 in the first place, knowing it's only going to break again anyway. More often than not, customers will not proceed with that repair and the laptop becomes e-waste. Just like MSI, Dell are potentially facing at least one class action lawsuit over their intentionally defective hinge designs, and in this case there's one specific to this exact model. In the provided photos on this legal firm's website, you can actually see how the hinges let go at the exact spot you'd expect them to. Low-cost laptops aren't always quite this bad, but Dell's design is objectively garbage. Speaking of garbage, the display temporarily held up by that crappy hinge is spectacularly bad. You might not have realized it, but there's at least one factory somewhere that's still cranking out 1366 by 768 TN LCD displays, which on a 15-inch panel gives you a pixel density of only 100 pixels per inch. Unfortunately, things just get worse from there. Out of the box, there's an intense blue cast, and after calibrating this out, the maximum brightness plummets from an already pathetic 244 nits to a completely woeful 211. Contrast is an unbelievably low 314:1, and a full 38% of the basic sRGB color gamut remains unaccounted for. Color rendering is hopeless, and even UI elements like the Windows Settings app show ugly and distracting graininess. To put this into simple terms, this display is disgusting, and even 20 years ago it would have been a disappointment. Adding insult to injury, the panel fitted to my brand new unit shows clusters of bright pixels in all of the corners, and it's extremely distractingly prone to distortions from pressure applied to the lid. And above that awful screen is an awful webcam. Dell's website humorously describes this as camera plastic. Audio is provided by a tiny little Realtek ALC3204, and predictably enough, sound is completely acceptable through the headphone jack and kind of awful through the speakers. The internal sound system is a very basic 2-channel setup rated for 2 watts per channel, with the usual crappy little oval speaker drivers mounted in surprisingly large boxes. But while at first glance it looks like these are shock mounted, they're actually attached so loosely that they can easily rattle around in the chassis. I think the engineers got bored about halfway through designing this system. Included storage is a WD SN740 SSD mounted in an extremely bizarre way to the board using a 2280 size stamped metal bracket that simply smushes the actual 2230 SSD into the board and asks it very nicely not to move. Fascinating. As it turns out, this imposture of a WD SSD is in fact a SanDisk unit in disguise using both a SanDisk controller and SanDisk NAND flash. Read and write speeds are just about 50% of the maximum speeds of an old PCIe 3 SSD, so this drive is not particularly impressive, but those speeds are more than adequate for general usage. As is fairly typical for these low-end machines, there's no slot for a second drive despite plenty of unused space in the chassis. Wireless connectivity is provided by a Realtek chipset which only supports Wi-Fi AC and Bluetooth 5.0. Both antennas are located in the lid and I've had no issues with reception or connectivity. Pre-installed software bloat on this one isn't great, mostly because it results in a full 72% of the system RAM being full immediately after a cold boot, and that doesn't include any app caching. I would suggest immediately uninstalling all of the Dell and McAfee software, but I predict that you won't be buying this laptop anyway, so that doesn't matter. Speaking of that Dell software, the only thing you might find even mildly useful is the My Dell app. If you have the patience to wait and wait and wait for it to load, this eventually acts as a central hub for power, display, and audio modes. If we're being completely honest, the audio and display settings are completely and utterly pointless because neither the hopeless LCD or garbage tier speaker system is salvageable with any amount of software tweaking, so you're better off just leaving these alone. The power section is more interesting. You've got highly detailed battery charging settings with 4 automatic modes and an interesting adjustable slider with both a start and stop limit on the battery so you can keep it within a very precise range. I'm not personally into this level of micromanagement, but it's very cool to see. Underneath are 4 thermal management modes, all rather amusingly named since no matter what mode you choose, this computer has no choice but to remain cool and low performance. Overall power draw on the Inspiron 15 is very low. At idle in balanced mode while plugged in, as measured from the power outlet, the machine uses around 5.5 watts, and when running flat out with the CPU fully loaded up, this increases to around 32 watts. The 41 watt-hour battery fitted to this unit is reporting exactly 41 watt-hours after calibrating over a few charge cycles. This will gradually drop with use, but it's off to a good start. With the display set to the very low maximum brightness and sitting idle on the Windows desktop, the Inspiron managed 12 hours and 36 minutes of runtime. Doing my usual heavy internet usage test, which is of course wildly unscientific, it quit after 6 hours and 56 minutes. Charging from empty, the battery takes 57 minutes to hit 50%, 1 hour 32 minutes to hit 80%, and it's full after 2 hours and 11 minutes. When it finally wears out, the battery is relatively easy to replace, being held in by 3 screws and no adhesive. The good looking and absolutely tiny processor included here is AMD's Athlon Gold 7220U. Built on TSMC's 6nm process, the 7220U is a dual-core chip based on AMD's aging Zen 2 architecture with SMT enabled on both cores and support for 2 channels of LPDDR5 memory. TDP is rated at 15 watts and the maximum boost clock speed is 3.7 GHz. Power is provided by a suitably light-duty 2+1 phase power supply arranged in a surprisingly spread out way on the board. RAM supplied with this unit is a pair of 4GB Micron LPDDR5 5500 chips soldered straight onto the board. Soldered RAM is pretty much compulsory with these low-power AMD Mendocino chips, and what's fitted here is both big enough and fast enough, but it sure doesn't do anything to improve the appeal of this machine. Lastly, the integrated GPU is AMD's tiny little Radeon 610M. Approximately 1/40th of a Radeon 6900 XT, this little iGPU is DirectX 12 Ultimate compliant, but don't set your expectations too high. The system tasked with extracting heat from the SoC is a very predictable single fan, single heat pipe setup, breathing air from the vents underneath and out through the hinge via a 3.5 CFM fan made by Delta Electronics. Cold plate surface is finished surprisingly well with almost no visible pitting or other defects. Without the fan, the cooler weighs an incredibly low 19 grams, which means there's almost no thermal mass to absorb transient heat loads without kicking up the fan speed. Either because of how floppy the shell is, or due to sloppy designing the fan, you can actually hear the blades grinding against something when you move the laptop around while it's running. It's kind of fun. If the dual-core CPU and 128 shader GPU didn't give it away, this laptop isn't really intended for heavy workloads, so of course we've gone ahead and subjected it to a heavy workload just to see what happens. Because there are only 2 low-power cores here and we want to fully load up the power delivery and cooling, I've run Cinebench to stress the CPU cores and MSI Combustor to stress the integrated GPU simultaneously for a full 30 minutes, with the laptop sitting flat on the desk in its highest performance power mode. Predictably enough, even with the SoC fully utilized, power consumption remains fairly low on this one. There's no short-term higher boost level, so at full load, the overall package power just barely nudges into 20 watts. As far as temperatures go, well, in the high performance mode, Dell have set the fan to severely overreact to temperature increases, so instead of stabilizing the temperature early on, it gradually creeps up for around 20 minutes before maxing out at an unnecessarily low 68 degrees. Predictably enough, the CPU core frequencies, all 2 of them, stay pegged at the maximum rated clock of 3700 MHz pretty much indefinitely. It's hard to fault the power and cooling systems of this laptop since they keep the little AMD SoC running fully at its rated speeds under load, and that's easily the most positive thing I have to say about this system, or rather the only positive thing. So what exactly does that 20 watts get you in the way of performance? Well, I hope you're not expecting too much. CPU performance is incredibly low on these Athlons, to the point where I highly doubt you're going to find anything less powerful on the market. Scores for both single and multi-threaded tests in both Geekbench 6 and Cinebench R23 are comically tiny and absolutely trail the rest of these lower-end chips, even Intel's Atom-based M305. This is definitely a single tasking only laptop, and a pretty mediocre one at that. Even basic web browsing performance is woeful, with BrowserBench's speedometer 6 clocking in at less than half of what would be considered an average score these days. Nonetheless, 8GB of reasonably fast memory and the decent enough solid-state drive help prop this machine up to a state of borderline adequacy in normal use. Navigating around the OS, browsing the web, replying to emails are all well within the capabilities of this one without testing your patience too severely, and impressively enough, it can even run the FL Studio demo songs without a hitch. Now, given the architectural similarities between these AMD Mendocino chips and the little powerhouse of an SoC inside Valve's Steam Deck, you'd be forgiven for thinking that some gaming might be on the table with this one. Well, 3DMark's Firestrike and TimeSpy benchmarks are a pretty clear indication that you're not going to be loading up any modern AAA titles, despite that tiny GPU's technical compatibility with DirectX 12 Ultimate. Dropping things back a decade, 2015's Dying Light actually runs surprisingly well on the 7220U, and with the graphics set to the lowest settings and resolution dropped to 1280x720, it can actually just about cling onto a playable frame rate most of the time. Still, as with most of these garbage tier machines, you're not actually going to want to do any gaming on here. The awful display, audio, and input devices all conspire to make your gaming experience completely and utterly miserable. So, to recap, Dell's Inspiron 15 offers a hopeless mixture of poor quality, fragile build, ugly looks, a horrible keyboard, dreadful screen, bad speakers, and in this configuration, it caps it all off with extremely low performance. You won't be surprised to see this machine being graded as complete crap, and since a better chip and display wouldn't even come close to salvaging this train wreck, I would strongly suggest that nobody buys this product or any of its higher end siblings. Right, 5 down, 1 to go, and we've saved the worst till last. See you next time.